I remember Stephen giving me advice one time on teaching, and he says, never start your presentation with an excuse or a disclaimer. But I'm going to right now. I like to pride myself on being pretty honest and open, for better or for worse. I'm the same person in this church as I am in my life, at work, and again, for better or for worse. I am going through mentally just kind of, I wouldn't say depression, but just a sadness. It's always this time of year is rough for me. It was about the time of year that I lost my dad. And because of that, it's just, I go through bouts of just sadness. And this year, I think, is especially rough because I'm recognizing that my son is the age I was when my dad died. So there's that part that's going on in my life. It's an odd feeling because I use my father as an example in raising my son. And now I'm getting to the point to where I don't have that example anymore. I'm kind of in uncharted territories. So just know that. Pray for me and Cassie, as I'm sure I'm not the funnest person to be around all the time. So if this teaching does not come across as exciting and elevated and just important, then the failure is on me, not in Scripture. When I learned this, when I'm about to teach, it changed my spiritual life. I was a 25-point Calvinist when I came into salvation, pretty hard on Calvinism. Learning this, what's about to be taught, it changed me into free grace. Learning how the law is applied to our life as Christians, or whether it's applied to our life as Christians, how the law, the legal code that's found in the Pentateuch fits in the Pentateuch, what its purpose is, changed my life. And if it doesn't change your life, then that's my fault by not communicating it clearly and effectively. I just realized it's leap year too. It's not? Oh, man. Is it leap year, though? No. All right. So, disclaimer out of the way. And me being bad at math and dates out of the way. We're going to conclude our study of Exodus. And we actually kind of wrestled with this because we got to Exodus 19. We finished up. And then, if you remember the structure of the Pentateuch, it was narrative up to 19, then verse 20, or chapter 20, and then it was legal code. And then this legal code is broken up by smaller narratives throughout the rest of the Pentateuch until you get to Deuteronomy. So we actually struggled with how to finish Exodus and not knowing if us actually teaching through the legal code would be edifying for the church. So through that, what we discovered is we didn't want to end at Exodus because Moses wrote the Pentateuch as one book. We separated it in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So it almost felt like by ending in Exodus, it felt like teaching to Matthew chapter 17 and just moving on. So we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to end at Exodus, but we didn't know how to finish it. And I think this is going to wrap it up pretty well. We're going to teach the rest of the Pentateuch in one sitting. Yeah. What I'm going to say may be new to you. It may be controversial, but I want you to give me some grace. Let me teach it all the way through. And then disagreements, we could talk about it at the end. This is not something new that I invented or that Renewal invented. This is something that I learned through Selhamer. That Selhamer learned and also didn't invent this. And it's something that our church fathers recognized about the Pentateuch and our the Jewish rabbis recognized in the Pentateuch. And it's gotten lost somehow in modern day Christianity. So without burying the lead anymore, I'm going to teach why Christians should not teach the law. Okay? The reason for that, again, is if we think about Moses as the author, we got to think about how he structured his writing in the literary devices that not only he used, but that were common in ancient Near Eastern text. These literary devices, we in English will use capitalization, paragraph indentions, commas, periods, exclamation points. These are literary devices. In Hebrew, those didn't exist. So there are other ways to structure a story to where, again, we would use paragraphs. They would use chiasms. They would structure putting poetry at the end of a narrative that will bifurcate two narrative sections. There are things like this that is just kind of lost if you just read it in English. It takes some studying to do to learn these literary structures. And I believe, or literary devices, I believe that the law, the legal code in the Pentateuch, is another literary device used by Moses to drive a theological point, not a legal point. What I'm going to argue for is that the law, as it's found in the Pentateuch, is not meant to administer justice or to enforce the law. The law is there, or the legal code in the Pentateuch is there to drive the main theological point of the Pentateuch, which is faith. So I think there are some focal points that focus on these, then we'll argue out of that. I think we covered this. Who wrote the Pentateuch? Who do we teach wrote the Pentateuch? Moses. Who is Moses comparing himself to? We've taught through this the entire Exodus study. Moses is making a comparison of two people. Cassie said himself and Abraham. I agree with that. Where does Abraham die? In the Promised Land. Abraham dies. Well, Abraham, this is kind of I remember teaching through Genesis, and I think it's chapter 27 where Abraham buys a plot of land, and it's kind of just a random thing. Sarah dies, he buys a plot of land to bury his wife in. It's just kind of random that that's in there. But the point of it, again, is Abraham is showing faith. This is a land that God promised to him and his relatives forever. So he buries his wife there. Then he's buried there, and his sons are buried there, and their wives. So Abraham, in chapter 26, God says of Abraham that he obeyed my laws, my statutes, and my covenants. There is no law in Genesis. So Moses, writing of Abraham, it could be summed up in this way. Be like Abraham, live a life of faith, and it can be said of you that you obeyed the law. So Abraham dies in the Promised Land. Where does Moses die? In the wilderness. Why is Moses not allowed in the Promised Land? Because he did not believe. A lot of commentators, a lot of preachers, when in Numbers 20, God tells Moses to speak to the rock and command for water to come out of it. Moses gets really rude and angry at the people, calls them rebels, and he strikes the rock. And then God says, because you have not believed in me, you've not kept my name holy, you and Aaron will not deliver these people into the Promised Land. Okay? The reason I bring up other commentators and other preachers is you can run the gambit. You can read so many reasons why they'll say, well, it's because he struck the rock when God told him to speak to it. Or he struck the rock twice when God told him to speak to it. Or he yelled at the people. or many other reasons. There's 100 interpretations of that. Well, that's probably not true. There are a lot of interpretations of why Moses wasn't allowed to lead the people into the promised land. And I think because there's so many different ways that people look at this, I think that should give us a hint that maybe it's not because Moses did something wrong. Maybe it's exactly what God said. It's because he did not believe. So it is faith, or lack thereof, is why Moses dies in the wilderness. And he does not obtain the blessing of going into the promised land. But we are so hyper-focused on what people are doing wrong. We're so focused on works that even when it's, to me, clear as day that it's an issue about faith, we're so focused on works, we want to point out, we want to try to figure out what Moses did wrong. We want to look at what he did and what he didn't do, rather than just acknowledging the fact that Moses is making a point about how it's faith. Moses, who delivered the law, who I don't think you can point at anything in Moses' life once the law comes into play. I don't think you can look at anything that says he broke the law. I don't think there's any failure on Moses as far as keeping the law. He delivered the law, yet he dies in the wilderness. He doesn't obtain the blessing. And I think I said last time I taught, I think what Moses is driving at is there's little hope of blessing through the law. I think the New Testament writers pick up on this. I think the Old Testament writers, when David and Nehemiah and Ezra, they pick up on this as well. That's from the last study I did. What they recognize is there's little hope for blessing under the law. How do we know this? Because Moses dies in the wilderness. Abraham dies in the promised land. Now, had Moses, this might come off really clumsy. Had Moses died in the wilderness because of some deficiency in keeping the legal code, then it would be fair to say that had Moses kept the legal code, he would be in the promised land. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, it sounds weird. I'm just not putting it together in my head. But I think that's right. If you see a deficiency, if we can see a deficiency in Moses keeping the law, and he dies in the wilderness, then we can say it's because he didn't keep the law that he died in the wilderness. So the opposite of that would be true. Had he kept the law, he might have died in the promised land. He would have led the people into the promised land. He would have obtained the blessing. Yet we can't find a deficiency in Moses in keeping the law. What we find is a deficiency in faith, which is why he's unable to obtain the blessing. Yeah. So, this main theme that we've been driving at, not only in Exodus study, but in the Genesis study, through the Exodus study, and it's going to carry on, I think, through the entire Pentateuch. Does anybody remember? We've said it over and over and over. How does man properly relate to God? By faith. Man properly relates to God through faith. This is the main theme that we've been driving at through our entire study of Genesis, Exodus, and now I think it continues on through the Pentateuch. So faith is the main theme that we're driving at when we get to legal code and we recognize there's a shift in the way the story's being written. Do we also shift our focus and say, okay, now the main thing is not faith anymore? Do we shift our focus and say, okay, now what's the main thing? We don't. We keep our eyes focused on the main thing of the Pentateuch, which is man properly relates to God through faith. Then we see the legal code, and we should ask ourselves, how does the legal code fit in to this main theme of faith? Because what I think is happening, I truly believe that I think how Moses is writing this story, and he's writing this book, the Pentateuch, is that he is putting the law in opposition to faith. A lot of times we try to merge the two. We try to marry faith and law, and we try to figure out how we can obey the law in a way that is by faith, or do the law in a way that fits in with salvation and this free grace that we teach at renewal, when in reality, I think Moses is putting those two opposed to each other. Why the law? Because of transgression. When we see the structure of the Pentateuch in this legal code, what we'll notice is that there are four sets of legal code found in the Pentateuch. You have the Decalogue, which is the Ten Commandments, and the Covenant Code, starting in verse 20. The next set is the Priestly Code, and the next set, the next set is the Holiness Code. What we see when we read these throughout the Pentateuch, what you'll notice is there are gaps, right? So Exodus 31 happens. Then there's about a 4-chapter break in between the Covenant Code and the Priestly Code. Exodus 31 to 35. Can anybody tell me what happens in Exodus 31 to 35?
Jeremiah brought it up when he taught Matthew last time, I think. Anybody remember?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. So I said the golden calf narrative. So Exodus 31 to 35 is the golden calf narrative. So what we find, what begins to emerge, is in between what a lot of people think, and the way I used to view this, was that the legal code is separated by little portions of narrative. But in reality, I think if we shift it and we say that it's not legal code being separated by narrative, it's narrative being separated by legal code. That way our focus is still on reading the Pentateuch as a narrative, not reading the legal code that just so happens to have like boring, interesting narrative. Boring, interesting narrative. We should recognize that it's one narrative that is interrupted by legal code. Okay? So if we find the covenant code, the Ten Commandments in the covenant code, who was that for? Who was to obey this? Israel, the nation. It was for the entire nation. So, then the golden calf happens. Who's responsible for the golden calf? Aaron. Who was Aaron? High priest. There was a failure on the part of the priest than the priestly code. I don't know if you guys can see that well. There is a failure on the part of the priest, then enters the priestly code. Why is the Ten Commandments in the covenant code in chapter 20? Because there was a failure from the nation. There was a failure of the Israelite people to go up the mountain and meet God, so they get law. 19, failure, law. Golden calf narrative, failure on the part of the priest, law for the priest. Life becomes more burdensome and more complicated for the priest of Israel. Not because this was God's intended purpose to bring them out of Egypt, to bring them out of bondage into the wilderness, into freedom, and then give them more bondage by the law. This was not God's intended purpose. It's because of failure. Like, you don't want to meet me, you don't want to have faith, here's bondage. Then we find, after the priestly code, there's this weird, you probably miss it, because I know we all read through the Bible in a year, but when we get to Leviticus, we're get through it real quick. There is a 9 verses in Leviticus 17 where, again, narrative picks up again. So legal code, narrative. Narrative, legal code because of failure. Narrative, failure of the priest. Priestly code, burdensome because of the failure of the priest. Then you get narrative again in chapter 17. That says goat idols. I think the actual word is goat demons. What you'll find is, after the priestly code, what the people are doing is, instead of bringing their animals to the altar to sacrifice to God, they're taking their animals outside of the camp and they're sacrificing them to goat demons. And it's like kind of odd. But then the holiness code picks up right after that. The holiness code is for the nation. So the priests didn't fail. They were not the ones taking these animals to sacrifice to goat demons. The people were. So now there's a holiness code for the nation. What we also find is the Ten Commandments and the covenant code. If you read through that, you'll find the tabernacle in there. You'll find that it was it wasn't that difficult, right? It is not hard to prevent yourself from murdering someone. That's not a huge stretch. Cassie disagrees. It is not difficult to not covet your neighbor's wife. These are things that should be universal to everyone. You'll find the tabernacle in chapter 25. It's to be made of rock and earth. It is not some elaborate tabernacle. Every man's altar is in the covenant code, where people can still bring their animals to sacrifice to God themselves in the covenant code. Then there's the golden calf narrative. Because the priest failed, there's the priestly code. Now it is no longer in every man's altar. It is no longer a simple tabernacle of rock and earth. Now it's an elaborate with brass and gold. There's lampstands. It's just more and more complicated because of the failure of faith, not because God intended for them to have this law. What God intended was to meet them on the mountain. God wanted a relationship with Israel. He didn't want legal codes. So this is the controversial part that I think David recognized. I think early, before Christ rabbis, they recognized that in the Pentateuch, the legal codes were not intended to be used as legal code. I have reasons why I believe this. One of the things we do is we'll read the legal code as a legal code, as if the Jewish people in 500 BC would read the Pentateuch and it's like, okay, this is how they know the law. This is how they kept the law, is by reading this legal code. What we don't do is we don't read Genesis chapter 6 through 10, and we see clear commandments from God to Noah to build the ark with gopher wood, with tar, to make it this big, to make it this high, to fill it with animals. We read that commandment, and we recognize something. We recognize that God's commandments to Noah in Genesis is intended for Noah, but it's also driving the narrative. So we look at the commandments to Noah, and no one thinks, okay, I got to go out and build an ark. But when we read the legal codes, for some reason, we do just that. We start asking questions about, like, well, can we eat shellfish? Can, I wear mixed fabrics? Can I eat cloven-hooved animals? Is that the right word? Cloven? Is that a word? Yeah? Sounds weird. So, how do I know, or why do I believe the legal code's intended purpose was not to be used as legal codes? We find in Numbers 31:21, Moses writes this: Then Eleazar, the priest, said to the men of war who had gone to battle, "This is the statute of the law which the Lord has commanded to Moses." And then he goes on, after this, he gives what that commandment is. It's something about water purity and gold or something. Point is, Moses did not record this law that Eleazar is talking about. He didn't record it anywhere in the legal codes. So we can tell just from this verse, and there's other verses like this, that God commanded Moses certain statutes and laws that Moses purposely did not put in the legal code. Does that make sense? Of the Pentateuch. Yeah, Levi brings up a good point. Real quick, what I'm not saying is that the Israelites and the Hebrews did not have a law that they were supposed to obey. They definitely did. They had a law, they had a system of legal codes that they were supposed to obey. They had a sacrificial system and all that. What I'm arguing for is that legal code that the Hebrew and the Israelites were to follow is not what we find in the Pentateuch. Does that sum it up pretty good? Yeah. Yeah. Moses is purposefully being selective of the laws he's including in the Pentateuch. It is not exhaustive. How do we know that? Because right here, it talks about a law that Eleazar said that Moses purposefully didn't record in the Pentateuch. He left it out. So we don't have an exhaustive legal code. So you cannot expect someone to follow and obey a legal code if it's not exhaustive. I can't give rules to my son and expect him to follow those rules. Oh, wait. I can't have a law code in my head, rules that he should obey without telling him. That wouldn't be fair to him. I can't say, well, I don't want you wearing. I can't think in my head, I'm going to ground him if he wears pink shirts. And then I don't tell him, and then he wears a pink shirt, and then he gets in trouble for it. So because the legal code is not exhaustive, we cannot expect to follow it. That can't be what its intended purpose is to obey this legal code within the Pentateuch. So we're trying to figure out what's the purpose of it, right? It's not intended to be used as a legal code. Another point that could be made, another argument for this, is the structural observations that we find. The structural, which that probably sounds boring, but it's actually really interesting. Does anybody know how many laws are in the entire legal code? Yeah, so Cassie Levi said 611. Traditionally, I think 613. But what we do, how they get to 13 is they take the Shema, Hear, O Israel, Lord your God, the Lord is one. They take that, count that as a law, which I don't think you should. Then they also take the heading of the Ten Commandments. They take that as a law. So I think the real number of the legal codes found in the Pentateuch is 611. There's something interesting with the Hebrew language, that letters correlate with numbers. So if we see like a dalet, which we would translate as a D, that dalet also equals 4. A vav, am I saying that right? A vav, which is what we would write as a V, that equals 6. Hebrew letters correlate with Hebrew numbers. What we find incredibly interesting is the word Torah, which means a law. Can anyone guess what the letters equal? Cassie said 611. So that is really interesting. Huh? Reading your mouth? I find that incredibly interesting that there are 611 laws and the word Torah, which means a law, equals 611. In the covenant code, we find 42 laws. The heading of the covenant code, and these are the judgments, that equals 42. There are 7 sets of 6 in the covenant code, which equal 7 times 6, 42. So there are structural observations we can make that if somebody is not putting an exhaustive list together, but they're trying they're being purposefully selective so that we can find all of this out. That makes more sense. They're being purposely selective to have 611 laws because the word law equals 611. I included this. This isn't working anymore. That's the word Torah, 611. Laws in the Pentateuch, 611. Covenant Code, 42. I don't remember my point of bringing this up, but I'll teach it anyway. Right, thank you. That's exactly what it was. We recognize genealogies in the Old Testament are selective. How do we know that? Because Matthew records 28 plus 14, 42. Yeah? Matthew records 42 generations from Jesus to Abraham, while Luke records 41 from Jesus to David. Luke includes 77 generations from Jesus to Adam. So we know that Matthew is being selective in his generations. We can recognize that, and we have no problem with that, because Matthew is trying to make a point. The point is, like I said, the Dalet, the Vav, and the Dalet, that spells David. That number equals 14. There are 3 letters that equal 14. Matthew records 3 sets of 14 to get from Jesus to Abraham, because Matthew's trying to show that Jesus is the greater David. Jesus is the true king of Israel. Now, if Luke uses 41 generations to get from Jesus to David, and Matthew uses 28 generations to get from Jesus to David, who's right? Which one's right? They both are. They're both right, because they're not trying to make an exhaustive list of genealogies. What they're doing is they're using these genealogies to drive at a theological point. And in the same way, we can tell from the structural observations using numbers and sets that Moses is being selective as well. In the same way Matthew is being selective in his generations to drive a theological point, Moses is being selective in the legal codes that he includes in the Pentateuch to drive a theological point. And what was that point? That every time there's a failure on behalf of the people, more legal code, more burden, more complexity in life. Not because the legal codes aren't the point. The point is the failure of faith. There's a failure on behalf of the people, then legal code. One last thing to drive this home. Scholars recognize that ancient Near Eastern legal codes, none of them that survived, were intended to be used as the administration of law. If we look at Hammurabi's code, it is clear, and it is not universal, but it is close to universally accepted that Hammurabi's code was not used to administer justice. What its intended purpose was to show Hammurabi as a just and wise king. And I think that is part of the reason behind the legal code in the Pentateuch, is to show Moses as just and wise. But through all his justice and all his wisdom and all his keeping and obeying of the law, Moses dies in the wilderness. Why? Because he didn't believe. Faith is the point of the Pentateuch, not works of law. If the purpose of the legal code was to teach the legal code, then Moses would not have died in the wilderness. Moses obeyed the legal code. He delivered the legal code. And it wasn't enough to save him. It wasn't enough for him to obtain the blessing of the promised land. Another disclaimer, I think I've said it every time because it sounds like I'm being really harsh on Moses. I recognize that Moses is in heaven. I recognize that Moses is with Jesus now. But Moses is setting himself up in his own writing so that you recognize, don't be like Moses, be like Abraham. Just in this one instance of law versus faith. For sure, in your Christian life, try to be like Moses, because I think he was a pretty cool guy. But the intended purpose of Moses and the legal code is to show you that the purpose is not the legal code. So what's tricky about this message is I'm teaching how we shouldn't teach the legal code. Does that make sense? And again, I feel like I'm not hitting the point well. Because this changed my life. Recognizing that Moses died in the wilderness because of faith, not because of the works of law, changed my life. We suffer as a church in this country, not this church. We suffer because of legalism. Broken people should have grace and mercy for broken people. But what we do is we come to church and we put on our church face. We have our family and we're perfect. Then you have broken people come in and they realize they're not perfect. They can't be like you. So what's the point in coming? When we should be honest with ourselves, we should be the same people in church as we are in our life. We should recognize that church is for the broken. And if we're not honest in this church and we're not honest with each other, then we're never going to grow. We're never going to have people come in to this church if we're perfect. This legalism that plagues the church, and I'm sure we all know people like this, that they could care less about your love and your kindness, your humility, and your care for other people. What they want to focus on is what we're doing Friday night, what we're doing Saturday night. You know, you work for this company, you know this company does this, you invest in that company, do you recognize with that? Why do we do that? Because we're focused on people's work. When we read in Numbers that why Moses wasn't allowed to take the people into the promised land, what do? We don't recognize, we just skip right over the fact that God said it's because of his faith that he's not able to do that. And what we do is we try to see something in Moses' life. We try to see a failure of his work. We judge his life rather than his faith. When we see Abraham, we should recognize faith in his life. When we look at Moses, we focus on works of the law. When I think Moses is trying to make the exact opposite point. Don't look at the law. Don't look at the work in people's life. Look at their faith. Look, even when we get to the legal codes, the intention is not to obey those legal codes in the Pentateuch. The intention is to look at the failure of faith. Just because legal code is in there doesn't mean we shift our focus from Genesis to Exodus to Leviticus, Numbers. It's still a narrative. Moses wrote the Pentateuch as a narrative, and he's using the legal codes to highlight the failure of faith on behalf of the people. And this is a linchpin for me. And again, I'm not doing it justice. I'm not. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me to treat me holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I've given them. I was talking to Cassie and her sister on the ski trip last weekend. And it's funny, her sister's reading through the Bible, the chronological Bible in a year, that thing. And which is odd because it goes Genesis, Job, Exodus, which I recognize Job was probably around the time Moses was alive. I recognize that. But again, it's like putting Philippians in like the middle of Matthew. Right? You're separating books. So of course you're gonna miss major themes if you start putting books inside other books. That's neither here nor there. But we were talking, and she was in the golden calf narrative. And then we kind of talked about this, what I'm teaching on now. I talked about with Cassie and her sister. And Cassie knows this. She hears me ranting it in the living room all the time. So as I'm telling Ashley this, Cassie's listening. And even then, even after hearing it 100 times, Cassie still, and I'm not picking on her. She's not here now, so that's odd. Both her and her sister still tried to find a failure in Moses. Like when it says, because you have not believed me to treat my name holy, it's like, the reason why God is saying that is because he struck the rock. We don't know that. We don't know. All God says is you did not believe me and you didn't keep my name holy. But we're so focused on finding out what Moses did wrong that we cannot accept. It is a hard thing to accept that it is faith alone. It really is difficult. I've said this before, Christianity is the only religion that teaches faith alone. It stands alone in the world religions that says you cannot do anything to save yourself. Most of us accept that as Christians. You cannot do anything to save yourself. What we can accept is that being saved by faith alone is enough, but maintaining faith alone is not enough. We want to say, is he really saved? I can look at this work in his life. I can look at these things in his life. And then we question salvation of people. It's easy to accept faith alone for salvation. It's difficult to recognize that somebody can be saved, they can have faith, and they can live like hell. But that's our religion. That's what the Bible teaches. And I think the more we go down that rabbit hole, the more we learn to accept that in people, not looking at their works for salvation, but looking at their faith for salvation, then we can become kinder. We can reach broken people. We can be more patient with people. Because it is difficult having expectations of how Levi should live, and then he fails to meet my expectation of how a Christian man should live. It is difficult. But it's through recognizing, through having discipleship and relationship with each other, that we recognize that saved people fail all the time. I probably fail more than I succeed. And Christ loves me through that, not because of my failure, in spite of my failure, and because of my faith. So I think if we marinate with this, I could recommend the book, The Pentateuch as a Narrative by John Selhammer. Study this. Read the introduction to that book, and Selhammer goes over it really well. Reading through that changed my life. I'm not communicating how big of a deal this is for me in an effective way, but that's my fault. I will close this study, this teaching, and I will close our study of the Pentateuch altogether with what we've been saying from the beginning. Did Selhammer say this, or is this, we just learned it from something? I think this is incredibly huge, and incredibly important. We recognize in Genesis, Adam and Eve, properly related to God through faith. Then they failed when they tried not trusting in God's provision of Eve provided for herself. There was a failure. They got kicked out of the garden. We recognize faith. It's because they didn't trust in God's provision. Moving forward, we can see the faith and life of Noah, the faith and life of Shem, of Abraham, of Jacob, of Joseph, Judah. We recognize in Genesis that their failures was lack of faith, wasn't trusting God. Our focus should not shift just because we get the legal codes in the Pentateuch. Our focus we should maintain that focus that man properly relates to God through faith. The legal codes are there because of a failure on behalf of their faith. Another thing that I'll leave you with, it's also incredibly important to me that in Exodus chapter 19, when they were supposed to go up the mountain, that is the last time Moses uses the word faith in a positive sense in the Pentateuch. So from Exodus 20 to the end of Deuteronomy, faith is never again used in a positive sense. So if we're trying to figure out what's the point of the Pentateuch, it's faith. We can know that it's faith through both the positive aspects of people living their life in faith, and we can also know via negativa, through people failing, that it's about faith. Got about 10 minutes. Do you want to say something? Yeah. Me and you taught through Exodus, so I feel seems appropriate for you to maybe on the last study.
Sure, yeah. So, I think it's important to recognize the legal codes as a narrative device in the text, right? We get so fixated, but when, and I don't think it's that controversial to say that it's not a comprehensive list.
Yeah, I think in scholarship,
that's fairly acceptable. But if it's not a comprehensive list, then if you have the Pentateuch as given cannot be that thing which, okay, here's the laws you're supposed to obey, right? Moses is using it to further, as you said, a theological point, the point of faith. And I think it's important for us as Christians because we get caught up. I mean, I remember, what was it, maybe 8-10 years ago, there was some stuff going on in the news, and remember Ben Carson. He was leading the polls for a while as far as primary stuff goes, and he had said something about someone else, like, oh, they shouldn't be allowed to run because they hold the Sharia law, right? And I was talking with one of my childhood friends about that, and he's like, well, how is this? I mean, he can't say that about them. I mean, he's a Christian. What about the law in the Old Testament? I mean, he believes in that, right? It's like, well, okay, so that's like, how do you talk about the law as a Christian, right? What is its purpose? And what we've been trying to show is that its purpose is to highlight faith, right? Paul talks about the law coming. Why did it come? It came because of transgression. And when you look, you see it's broken up by little narratives highlighting their transgressions, highlighting the failure, either of the people or the priests, right? When God originally wanted them to come up to the mountain, to be a kingdom of priests, and Moses reiterates that in, I think, Deuteronomy 6 or Deuteronomy 5, right? It says, because you did not come up on the mountain, you were afraid to meet God. You were afraid to meet God. And so it's always been about faith. But then we have this hope. Peter talks about it in 1 Peter, how we are now a kingdom of priests through Christ Jesus, right? He is the one who went up on the mount and he died for us. He died for us. He rose again. He lived a life of perfect faith and obedience to the law. And he died. And now we have faith in his provision and God's provision. So now we are a royal priesthood. God, he's not done that original intention to have a kingdom of priests, for his people to relate to him by faith. That's always been his intention. And we see its fulfillment through Jesus, the greater Moses, the greater David, the Mashiach ben David, the son of David, the Messiah, right? And so for us, I think it's extremely important, just for all the reasons you said, just to, we need to fixate on Jesus, our trust in him. We're all going to fail. We're all going to screw up. But we trust in God's provision. We can't provide the good for ourselves. God has provided the good. And so as we reach out to others, it's like God has provided for you, right? And I've talked to numerous people about, and you too, just not wanting to go to church because their life's not cleaned up, right? I need to get to a certain point before I can go to church, before I can meet and fellowship with other believers. I'm not cleaned up enough, or whatever it is, right? Maybe I curse too much, or whatever, right? It's like God has provided for you. He's provided, and you just need to trust in him. So, I really, going through this stuff has changed my view on the Pentateuch as well, and it's given me tools to really think about it and talk about it if people have questions. It's bolstered my faith and helped me understand the role of, that faith and law are in opposition. And, appreciate it, DC.
Amen. Any other comments or questions? We're done with the Pentateuch forever, so speak now. Or you got something?
Not a reputation, I just being a dispensationalist.
Yeah.
As I am. That God goes through these different phases, showing that this doesn't work.
Right.
This whole legal system and creating a nation based on a legal system, it demonstrated that, by itself, the law didn't work. Israel failed. And, so there is a purpose there so that man can learn. We don't get rid of it. It does reveal God's character. It does reveal, much about him. That he is a God of order, and a lot of things that we learn from it. But we also learn that the system, by itself, does not, is not sufficient. Okay?
Yep.
And so even in the New Testament it talks about one of the purposes of law is to show us that we're sinners.
Yeah.
One of the things that it does do is that, I didn't know, sin until all of a sudden that nasty one about thou shalt not covet.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm in trouble. Okay? So the law still has a purpose, and that purpose is not that it brings us to Christ, but it shows us what we are like without Christ.
Yeah, our failure.
Right.
It shows us our failure. Yeah, I agree.
I'm done.
That's it?
You want me to say more?
I'm just kidding. All right, if that's it for everyone, then I'll close in prayer. And again, recommended reading is the Pentateuch as a narrative by John Selhamer. If you really want to grasp what I think I am insufficient and able to teach this, just lack of skill, I guess, but marinate with this week. If you have time, try to find that book, try to read it. I think it could be life-changing. It changed my life. All right? Our God and Father, how grateful we are for your word and your character demonstrated in your word and revealed to us. We're thankful that it is a bottomless well of knowledge that a child can understand and a man can read for the rest of his life and still not touch the depth of the truth in it. I pray that we are committed to knowing you more, to knowing your word more, to studying who you are and what you've revealed. I pray that we're dedicated in seeing the faith in other people rather than their works, that we encourage them to live a good Christian life, but we don't judge them when they fail. I pray that our faith becomes stronger day by day. I pray that we as a church can grow together spiritually and in number, that you bless the work that we're trying to do here so that we can affect more people's lives in this community. I pray that we continue to be in one another's life, that we grow together in fellowship and relationship and discipleship. We love your Son, Jesus Christ. For without him, we are abandoned and lost without hope. And it's through our trust in your provision of your Son and his atonement and his sacrifice that we are saved. We love you and we praise you. Amen.